EVO.
Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised.
Roger, Joyce's brother, relates a quote that his mom said. He said the gray, and she's an older, obviously Taiwanese woman, and she said the gray hair should never outlive the black hair, meaning the older generation shouldn't outlive the younger generation. And it's a shame whenever that happens, and you always really, really feel bad for that.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 153, Travesty. Bobby, thank you so much for chatting with me again on these cases. How would you like me to introduce you to the show?
Bobby Chacon, retired FBI special agent.
If you're a follower of true crime, and I'm guessing you are because you're listening to this podcast, you've most likely heard the name Chandra Levy. She was the Washington, D.C. intern who went missing in May of 2001. Tragically, Chandra was found murdered a year later. But have you heard the name Joyce Chiang? Before speaking with Bobby, I'm sorry to say that I hadn't.
So the show is called Murder Has Two Faces, and what we do in each of our 3 episodes, we highlight 2 cases, and we basically kind of put them up against each other, and that's the mirror. In each episode, we highlight one case that had international, pretty much global attention on it, global publicity. You've probably heard the names, you've known the names, and then we juxtapose that with another case that was very, very similar in geography, etymology. So the cases are very similar in a lot of respects. Same time frame, same location, same type of victim. However, the other case got almost no publicity. And so we look into the whys of that, because my contention has always been, and I live this, that, a case that gets that kind of publicity, I always said publicity equals pressure. Like when there's publicity, my bosses used to get a lot of pressure. And then pressure equals resources.
This week, Bobby and I go over the disparity between the cases featured in a new documentary that takes a hard look at 3 cases, including Joyce Chiang's. Watched the show, and part of that too is that the disparity between how victims of color are covered versus how, white women in these cases are covered. And so you guys really talk a lot about that. What was that like for you? Because you actually worked these cases in your capacity as a FBI diver, right?
Right, that's right.
Talk a little bit about that and what that was like being a part of that production and taking that on.
Well, for me, it was really touching. It was good because this is something that, I spent my whole FBI career at the street agent level. I never raised my hand to go into management. I never wrote a desk. I could have become some senior FBI executive at headquarters. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to maintain my job of putting bad guys in jail or helping put bad guys in jail. And so we were always clamoring about this. Why is this one case getting the pressure and the publicity and the resources, and why is this other one not? And because we were much closer to the victims, and more so the victims' families, than our higher ups were. Certainly people in Washington, D.C. were. It really affected us more than people much higher than above us in the chain of command, who were making those decisions on where to put the resources. And so when this came along, having been involved in these cases, particularly in the first episode where I was involved in the case that got all the publicity, and in the second episode I was involved in the case that got none of the publicity. And so I saw it from both sides, and I saw how the resources come into play on both sides, and how it kind of leads to, ultimately a resolution and sometimes justice for the victim and the victim's families. And so, there's a basic feeling of unfairness there. And when you see it's because, people come from an immigrant community, say, or is a person born here but of an immigrant family, or is a person of color, as you said, or a woman of color, and so those are all, unfortunately, it seems to me, in that paradigm of publicity, those are strikes against you. If you're a woman, it's a strike against you. If you're a woman of color, it's a strike against you. And there's a basic, as an investigator, we approach everything, purely objectively. We have a victim and we go to work on the case. And it's a basic issue of fairness to us. And so it was heartfelt to me to be involved in these cases. And when I actually rewatched these shows, particularly the Joyce Chiang show episode, I get touched by it. I get a little choked up on it because it's like, we were there, we were working for her and her family, but for other forces at play, the resources weren't there.
Joyce Chang's parents emigrated from Taiwan, and they moved to the suburbs of Chicago.
Joyce was first generation American. Her parents are from Taiwan. I call them an all-American family because that's what they were. 4 children, 3 boys and a girl.
Just getting to the U.S. had been difficult. Being the only Asian family in the primarily white suburban neighborhood in Chicago in the 70s and 80s, let's just say it wasn't easy for the Chang family. Their neighbors didn't welcome them with pie and open arms, but rather open hostility. The tight-knit family endured severe prejudice. But despite these many injustices, Joyce and her brothers were encouraged to work hard and make a difference in the world, which is exactly what they did. After high school, Joyce was accepted at a prestigious all-girls university.
Goes to Smith College, very, very prestigious women's college, gets well educated. She's the student body president. She's like the life of the party. She's like this, a big personality.
Joyce moved to Washington, D.C. and interned for a congressman on Capitol Hill.
She goes to Georgetown Law School, very, very prestigious law school. I mean, she's like the immigrant dream, I think the American dream, of a first generation American who goes to Smith, then goes to Georgetown. Joyce she actually was, when she was in law school, interning for a Congress member. She was actually working all day in the congressperson's office and then going to law school at night. That's how hard a worker she was.
But Joyce wasn't alone in this journey. She shared a D.C. apartment with her brother, Roger.
Joyce was living in DuPont Circle, which is an area of Washington, D.C., where a lot of young interns, a lot of young government workers lived. It's a short commute to the general power structures of where they're mostly working.
In 1999, Joyce was just 28 years old. She'd earned her law degree by working all day and going to school at night. And now she had big plans to do great things. She had her whole life ahead of her.
And so she goes to work for what was then called the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, which is when, in my day, that's what now I guess ICE is now, or it's kind of bifurcated now. But the Immigration and Naturalization Service is where you would go when you wanted to become a naturalized citizen. And so Joyce is working as an attorney there. Her friends say, she had her life played out. She was in the seat of power. Then she was going to move to New York eventually and kill it in the world of law. And so she was this, she just this heart of gold. All her friends describe her as, this sweetest, nicest person. And she was smart. She was funny. She was personable. She was on a career path. She had a plan. She had a life plan that we would have been better off, having Joyce Chiang, out there as whatever she would have become.
For Joyce and her brother Roger, the morning of January 9th, 1999, a Saturday, was like any other weekend. Joyce woke up with plans to go into work, and she told Roger she'd be back later that night after having dinner and watching a movie with friends. But Joyce didn't come home that night. And she wasn't there Sunday morning. Roger was immediately concerned. He tried to push away his nagging fears, but he knew it wasn't like his sister not to check in. By Monday, Roger was frantic. He reached out to all of her friends and coworkers, but nobody'd heard from her. He went to her office. He was just looking for any clues at her desk that might indicate where she could be. He found nothing out of the ordinary there. So on Tuesday, Roger and Joyce's coworkers contacted law enforcement. Because Joyce was a federal employee, the FBI began investigating her disappearance right away. After talking to Joyce's friends and coworkers and loved ones, investigators were pretty quick to put a timeline together for Joyce. Just like she told Roger, she'd met up with some friends that Saturday night. After dinner and a movie, she'd asked her friend to drop her off at a nearby Starbucks in the DuPont Circle neighborhood. She wanted to get a drink, and so she just said, "Hey, I'm just going to walk the 4 blocks home." What Joyce did next was a complete mystery. None of her circle of friends and loved ones had heard from Joyce or knew where she was. It was like she vanished without a trace. Roger, Joyce's brother, was desperate. He knew that he needed to get his sister's name out there, that they needed tips from people to let them know if anyone had seen where Joyce went. So together with friends and family and coworkers, they all galvanized to plaster missing persons flyers around the DuPont Circle neighborhood. They hoped someone with information would see the flyer and reach out with information. They also contacted local media to let the public know that Joyce had gone missing. But in the days following, even after the appeal to the public, no one came forward with tips as to information about what had happened to Joyce Chiang. Even so, the first week after she went missing, the family held a widely publicized vigil, in part to honor Joyce, but also they wanted to spread the word far and wide that there might be someone out there who might know something, and if they did, they wanted them to reach out to the police. 12 agonizing days after Joyce's disappearance, investigators finally got their first lead, and it didn't look good. Joyce's Blockbuster card. Remember, this is back in 1999, so this is when people actually went to a store like Blockbuster and rented a video which had a movie on it that they would then bring home and watch at home. So they found that and other items which might have been in a wallet. These things were found on the bank of the Anacostia River. Even more concerning, Joyce's jacket was found lying in the road, the one she'd been wearing the night she disappeared, and one of the sleeves of her coat was positioned in a way that gave the impression that she'd been fighting for her life that night.
Her jacket was found there, and one of the sleeves was pulled inside out, indicating that it was either pulled off of her or she was trying to get away, and the sleeve kind of went inside out. I think it had a cut in the back of it too, some kind of, or a rip. And so we kind of knew there was some kind of struggle or physical altercation that happened between Joyce and someone at that location near the river's edge.
Finding Joyce's belongings was something, but it was a loaded something because it didn't instill confidence that she was still alive. Her family still hoped that she was. But now investigators had a potential crime scene to investigate. The working theory was that Joyce had been forcibly taken from her neighborhood in DuPont Circle and for some unknown reason brought to the banks of the Anacostia River. But for what purpose? Did she know her assailant?
This happened east of the Anacostia River. So, DC, if you think of the Potomac and the Anacostia forming a V, the main part of DC is in the middle of the V. And then east of the Anacostia River is an extension of DC, but it's kind of the more high crime area of DC on the other side of the river. Joyce was from DuPont Circle, which was up in the main area of DC.
Bobby's team led the grim search for what they believed they'd find in the freezing Anacostia River, the body of Joyce Chiang.
I mean, we kind of knew that she was probably in that river, and that's why we were searching the river.
Diving into those frigid waters of the Anacostia River was like plunging into a muffled silence. You couldn't see your hand in front of you, and the water was so polluted that under the surface there was all this hidden debris, garbage, and junk. And the divers could only feel like they were walking blindly in the water as they searched for objects. Not long into that search, one of them grabbed onto something.
We were searching the day they found a body, and all the press, because this was like right after it happened, right? Within weeks after it happened, maybe, just a few weeks after it happened, we were in the water. And so it was still kind of in the public's, it was still in their attention. It was still news media all over the place. And when we went out there to search and stuff, and then they found a body. And so everybody ran over, and it happened to be a male. It was unrelated. It was a male victim.
It was a relief to the Chiang family that the body wasn't Joyce. But they didn't have any other answers as to what happened to her. Investigators worked with the only clues that they had, her belongings, which they sent to the lab for forensic testing. But those items came up empty, meaning there was no suspect DNA profiles to pursue. Meantime, Joyce's family and friends continued to hold weekly vigils every Saturday night, and so many people attended. They also continued to post missing persons flyers on street lamps and in store windows. But as the days went on, the story of the missing young lawyer Joyce Chiang began to fade from local headlines.
Why did you say that, like, women, and especially women of color, like, if you're murdered, resources are not going to be put, why is that?
Well, I mean, I don't say that from personal experience. I worked cases that were assigned to me, and I say that because I just look at the statistics, and I'm in kind of the entertainment world. I do documentaries, I do podcasts, I do even drama shows. I do fictionalized drama, scripted drama shows. And you just know from, you read articles, you read stuff about how many Native American women are going missing off of reservations, or even, neighborhoods off of reservations. And you don't, it's an epidemic. I mean, if the number of women, if you take the number of women that go missing every year, and you say, that same number of people are getting COVID, it would be the top story of every TV station across the country. Oh my God, there's another variant of COVID. There's another outbreak of COVID. We have the same number of people that are, if not more, of young women that are going missing, and every day in this country, and yet we don't treat it the same. And so that's above my pay grade to determine, like, why those cases aren't getting the attention, why TV executives are not greenlighting shows that highlight more of those types of victims. I don't know.
3 months later, a canoeist was paddling around the Potomac River, downstream from the Anacostia River, where Joyce's ID had been found. 8 miles from where Joyce's belongings were discovered, a body had washed up on the riverbank. It was Joyce Chiang. Unfortunately, based on the state of her remains, a cause of death couldn't be determined.
They didn't have the resources that some of these other cases got because of the publicity of it. But Joyce's family did a really good job of keeping her in the news as best they could early on. But, it did go cold after a while, and that's because it left the headlines. It left the news. It wasn't the top of the news hour anymore, and it wasn't on the front pages anymore. And so things go cold sometimes because of that. If you have the publicity, people are still calling.
2 years after Joyce went missing, another young woman eerily vanished under similar circumstances. Chandra Levy moved to Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2000 to intern for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In May of 2001, the 23-year-old was scheduled to leave D.C. and head home to California, where she was from. But when Chandra's parents couldn't get a hold of her, they called police, and investigators went to Chandra's apartment in the same neighborhood in DuPont Circle where Joyce had lived. At Chandra's place, there was no sign of a struggle.
Chandra was an intern for a congressman, Gary Condit, and so they were both kind of involved in the power structure of Washington, D.C. Joyce then graduated law school, went to work for the government. Chandra was kind of interning for the government. Same type of victim, same age, same geographic location, same type of disappearance. I mean, Joyce disappeared after a night out with friends, last seen her at the Starbucks. Chandra was, I think, jogging through a park on her typical, afternoon jog or something. And so, these, on the surface, these look very much like similar cases.
But after Chandra Levy had been reported missing, her disappearance was immediately on all the local channels and was covered on the national news, too. Especially after it was discovered that Chandra was allegedly having an affair with a married congressman, Gary Condit. After Chandra went missing, investigators looked back into Joyce's case. Local police and FBI teams searched Anacostia Park and also the riverbanks of both the Anacostia and Potomac. The story became a huge topic of national news in the summer of 2001. It was reported that more than 60% of Americans were following the case. And when then Congressman Gary Condit sat down with Connie Chung for an interview on ABC, 23 million people tuned in.
Did you have anything to do with her disappearance?
No, I didn't.
Did you cause anyone to harm her?
No.
Condit would be ruled out as a suspect by police, but many people never stopped believing he was involved in her disappearance. Now, it's worth noting that Chandra Levy's disappearance occurred a few years after the 1998 sex scandal between President Bill Clinton and White House intern Monica Lewinsky.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
The saga continued for months, ending with the president admitting to having, quote, an inappropriate relationship with Monica Lewinsky, who had been just 22 years old, while the president himself was 49. Clinton was impeached by the House, but he was ultimately acquitted by the Senate. And that summer of 2001, the disappearance of D.C. intern Chandra Levy, who was allegedly having an affair with Congressman Gary Condit. But even though there were similarities between Chandra's disappearance and Joyce's disappearance and later murder, Chandra Levy's disappearance didn't fade away. Every detail was headline news across the nation and the world. And as a result, unlike in Joyce's case, resources were allocated to the investigation.
These cases that generate a lot of publicity also generate that pressure, which generates those resources, which then results in a solving of the case. And unfortunately, the contrast to that is the same type of case that doesn't get that kind of publicity then doesn't get those resources, and then oftentimes, many times goes unsolved because of that.
But there was also another idea germinating, that a serial killer was operating in D.C., especially when you compared the similarities between Joyce and Chandra. Both were young women, single, living in DuPont Circle when they went missing. But things really ramped up when, on America's Most Wanted, John Walsh theorized that the murder of Joyce Chiang and the disappearance of Chandra Levy could be connected to a serial killer.
Well, is that why you said earlier in our conversation, you said you don't like to use the term serial killer lightly? You said that? Is that
That's
why?
right. That's right. Because until you actually have a tie between the victims or a tie between the methods or the rituals or something else, lots of women go missing in this country every single day. Many of them are demographically similar, age, nationality, those kind of things. All of the things that make up a victim or victimology, many of them are similar. Many of them go missing. And you just can't throw the term serial killer out there because what it does is it instills fear in the public. And that may be misplaced. And so you have to be very, very careful, I think, with that moniker. Although now it seems we rush to that, and it's unfortunate.
Why do you think we want to rush to that?
Because it's sensational. Because we've made stars out of John Wayne Gacy. We've made stars out of Jeffrey Dahmer. We've made stars out of Ted Bundy. We make documentaries about them. We make fictionalized shows about them. We've made stars of them. We've sensationalized the serial killer genre here. And that's why it's always more juicy to go through, and label somebody a serial killer or label a possible serial killer. And so I think that's why, because it brings more, it's a bit salacious, but it brings more people's attention.
And how frustrating is that for you as an investigator? And then also these cases where, you're trying to shine a light on the unfairness of it, of these different cases. Will your show be as popular as a Ted Bundy, they make stars out of that, like it feels like, just being in this true crime genre myself, like when you try to tell a story about, victims who are marginalized, it doesn't get the attention no matter how hard you try.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And we can only highlight in our series, we highlight the problem. The solution is a lot more difficult. How you come up with a solution to that. You get more TV executives to greenlight more shows that highlight victims from marginalized communities. And we've had some success in that. We've had, murdered and missing in Montana. Native American missing women. We've had some focus on that. And so we've had a little bit of success in that. But by and large, if I can tell you, Doddles to donuts, if a young blonde girl goes missing tomorrow who's on a cross-country trip with her boyfriend and he shows back up in Florida, you're going to have, worldwide publicity on that case. You're going to have a Gabby Petito again. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of Gabby Petitos that don't look like Gabby Petito, that don't get any attention that Gabby Petito got. Now, should she deserve all the attention? Sure. Am I glad that case was solved? Of course. But there are many, many, many young women that are very similar age, very similar generation, and every other demographic except race, and you don't know their names. None of us know their names.
What happened next in the investigation into Joyce's murder was stunning. It's unclear as to why this happened to this day, but seemingly out of the blue, the Executive Assistant Police Chief Terrence Gaynor announced that Joyce's death could have been the result of a suicide.
Suicide? I felt so...
Yeah, that was one particular executive deputy sheriff or whatever in that jurisdiction. I don't know what possessed him to make that pronouncement. Now, look, during an investigation, a lot of different theories get looked at. We do. And I don't fault them for looking at that theory, because when they were investigating, what happened was it turned out that they were looking at a relationship she had. You look at personal relationships when someone goes missing, right? And she was having a relationship apparently with a coworker. Apparently that relationship ended. I don't know if it didn't end well or what, but there was some type of internal office procedure that they were going through to mitigate whatever happened between these two coworkers and their personal relationship. So you have to investigate that. Whether it's relevant or not, you do have to go down that road, because personal relationships often result in violence, especially man against woman violence, domestic partner, or what they call intimate partner violence. They had to investigate that. I don't fault them for investigating that. But the investigators kind of likely were going, it's out there, but it's very, very remote. We're going to just put it off to the side. Because until you actually solve the case, all of these different theories have a level of validity or not to them. But you can't put anything off the table until you get the one that actually has all the evidence and actually is the one you go with. And then everything else gets put away. But some reason, through this theory of her coworker that she had a relationship with that went bad, and that there was this internal kind of office procedure going on, that maybe she was despondent, and somebody put out there, and horrifically, that, sometimes in Asian cultures, people lose face and they do something to harm themselves or kill themselves because they've lost face, which is absolutely ridiculous. But somehow the deputy chief or somebody felt the need to stand up before the cameras and make that pronouncement as a possible theory. The theory's okay to investigate. It's not okay to put that out there to the public. And that's what happened. And that was a horrific thing to do to Joyce and to Joyce's family and friends and anybody that knew her. And it was not right. And, it was just one of those things that probably the investigators, were shaking their heads on why their boss decided to do that. But, usually you only make things like that public during an investigation if you think it's going to help, if it'll lead people to come forward and say, I know who that person is, or I saw this happen. Coming out and saying she might have committed suicide is not going to help your investigation. There's no way, because if that's what happened, no one's going to know that, except the person who actually killed themselves, and they're gone. And so, you only release that kind of information if it's going to have a strategic benefit to your investigation, going to forward your investigation by the public seeing it and responding to it in some way that's going to help your investigation. There's no way anything like that could ever help your investigation. So why put it out there? Until you're absolutely 100% sure that's what happened, you just keep that in the file off to the side, saying that's a remote possibility. And until we have a definitive cause, it's just going to be over there in the possibility pile. It was horrific that he made that pronouncement public in front of the cameras, and I can't help but wonder, the devastation that caused her family. Her parents were still alive, her brothers were all alive, her friends, her Smith friends, her Georgetown friends. I mean, it's just something that never should have happened, and it re-victimized Joyce and re-victimized her brothers and her family all over again.
I mean, that's exactly what I was thinking. You just perfectly said it, that it re-victimized them. And then, one could say like they wanted the case, that pressure to solve the case. Well, if we just say that she took her own life, that solves the case, right? I mean, I don't
Right.
know if that was the intention, but clearly you have to wonder if that was it.
A year after Chandra Levy went missing, a hiker made a grim discovery. In May of 2002, a man walking his dog in a remote part of Washington, D.C.'s Rock Creek Park happened upon a skull, bones, and clothing. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Chandra Levy. Her death was ruled a homicide. But despite an exponential amount of resources outlaid in Chandra's murder investigation, eventually her case went cold. But the appetite for solving Chandra's murder never went away.
When my bosses start feeling the pressure because there's so much publicity, they start saying, what do you need, to solve the case, kind of thing. And then in most cases, not every case, but resources equal results. So it's publicity equals pressure, pressure equals resources, resources equal results.
After 7 years, there would be a break in the investigation. In March of 2009, some fruits came from the new chief of Metro Police, Kathy Lanier's decision to allocate resources into jailhouse snitches.
When crime took a dip in DC, they realigned resources and they put a bunch of more detectives on the cold case files, and a new chief had taken place, and she directed the cold case to start like maybe using jailhouse interviews and jailhouse informants, and they did, and that's how they got. I think they actually used that same technique to get Chandra Levy's killer to confess to somebody.
In the Chandra Levy case, a suspect had been identified. 20-year-old Ingmar Guandike, who'd been convicted of assaulting 2 women around the same time Chandra Levy disappeared. According to this jailhouse snitch, Guandike confided that he'd murdered Chandra Levy. Guandike would be charged with Chandra Levy's murder. He denied having anything to do with it. But in November 2010, he would be convicted and sentenced to 60 years in prison for the first-degree murder of Chandra Levy. But something else would come out of these jailhouse confessions. New leads had been developed in Joyce Chiang's case. More than a decade after her murder, cold case investigators pieced together information they received from prison informants. That Joyce had been at the Starbucks by her house, and that at some point she'd encountered 2 men who intended to rob her and took her to the Anacostia River.
It's just a tragic loss for her family, and I just think all of us as a whole, when someone like that gets taken, so senselessly, it just angers me sometimes when people, ultimately the people who took her life were, probably drug users, and it was just a senseless event and a senseless murder.
Finding out, in all probability, what had happened to Joyce didn't mean that she would get justice. Because investigators believed they'd solved her murder, but they didn't have enough evidence to prosecute the suspects. 2 men who had been arrested for a kidnapping in Georgetown after robbing another victim 3 months after Joyce disappeared. The Chiang family wouldn't get justice for Joyce, but in May of 2011, they got an acknowledgement at a press conference by the Maryland Police Department Chief Kathy Lanier, who officially announced that Joyce's death had been ruled as a homicide. She also made clear that there had been statements made that were inaccurate. The police chief acknowledging that Joyce's death was the result of a homicide and not a suicide. Setting that record straight was extremely important to the Chiang family.
I did a lot of homicides early in my career in the FBI because I was doing mafia cases and gang cases. And so I actually went to the FBI, the NYPD homicide school that their homicide detectives go to. And one of the things I learned early on, and very basically, is, you put a Venn diagram of, the world of the victim and the world of the perpetrator, and where those two cross, your suspect pool comes from. If these 2 individuals were random to that neighborhood, they didn't live in DuPont Circle, obviously, and they didn't know Joyce. She was a random victim. That made it really, really difficult to figure out who they were. If you've got nothing else to go on, because you're looking at the victim, you're looking at her life, you're looking at the people around her. Did she have any enemies? All that kind of stuff. And then you're looking at this location. Did anybody used to hang out here looking to, hurt somebody or whatever? And if they were random to both of those things, they were certainly random to Joyce. If they were random to that location, then it would have been, all the more difficult to kind of identify them. And back then, we didn't have as many ring doorbells and surveillance cameras around and things like that. So, they got a break years later. I think that in a case like Joyce's, I think that was the best they were going to do. And I'm glad they did. And if you watch the show, you'll see Roger, Joyce's brother, who really was the one really that kept Joyce's case alive. He even says that was the level of justice they were going to get. And it kind of buried that horrific allegation of a possible suicide. It really kind of it wiped away, that tarnish that was on Joyce for a while, for a long time. And it said, this is a person that was victimized. She was murdered and she deserved better. And at least being able to identify the two people who did this to her was a measure for her family of justice. And Joyce was, her remains were transported back to Los Angeles here, and she was, placed next to her dad. My mom was still alive when she passed. But
speaking of justice, Ingmar Guandike, the man who was convicted for Chandra Levy's murder in 2010, later that conviction would be overturned, and a retrial was ordered. However, in 2016, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia dismissed all charges against Guandike, basically saying they couldn't prove a murder case against him beyond a reasonable doubt. Authorities cited that the jailhouse confession, on which the original conviction was based on, came from an unreliable witness. I want to thank my guest, Bobby Chacon, for coming on the show. I highly recommend his new documentary, Murder Has Two Faces, but also keep an eye out for his other work.
This is 25 years ago almost now. Nowadays, people the internet picks it up themselves. And, you get podcasts like the ones you do, and you get a lot of other ways to keep publicity and keep people talking about it now. We have so much more ways to communicate now than we did even 25 years ago, which seems like a short time to me because I remember these cases like they were yesterday. But the volume and the timeliness of communication now is so much greater that cold cases constantly get flooded with more tips now than they were back then. And cases don't go as cold now as they did back then, or don't go cold as quickly.
I'm curious now how you're taking your career and getting into entertainment, using that. Like, what do you hope to accomplish? Because you seem like you have so much passion. I remember talking to you about the Israel Keys case, and you were, I still think about the eagles soaring over, when you were doing that, and the amount of it feels like you really take these cases to heart. They're not just cases, they're the humanity of it all,
Yeah, I mean, my desire, my drive is to tell the stories of the people who do the work. People, I mean, the victims as well. But right now, my projects really involve the people that do this work for long periods of time, and the effect it has on them, their families, and their lives, and how they live with it in the aftermath. And because I'm currently in the middle of that, I'm living the aftermath of that in my retirement. And believe me, there are times when my wife wants me to get out of this and not have to, cover the cases that I covered when I worked them, because she knows
because of PTSD.
Yeah, and because she knows that I've always taken a piece of those cases still with me. They never leave you. I remember the first dead child I ever recovered. I remember every dead child I ever recovered in the water. And she gets tired of waking up in the middle of the night when I wake up screaming, because I've had, sometimes those children come back to me in dreams. And so, I want to tell the story of people that do this work. And that's what most of my projects now, when I'm not doing documentaries, which I'm doing another one next week, or I'm not helping in investigations, I'm doing an investigative documentary now about a girl who disappeared in 2001, I think, in Miami, and was never found. And so I'm doing some of those documentaries, but I'm doing scripted stuff, and most of my scripted stuff revolves around the people who did the work. You often see them portrayed, unfortunately, as very two-dimensional characters on TV, especially network TV dramas that run an hour and have to tell the whole crime and investigation and resolution in an hour, or really 43 minutes with commercials on network television. And that's just not enough. Sure, you get to tell the story of the investigation, but you don't get to tell enough about the victim, and you certainly don't tell enough about the people that, were driven to solve the case and what they lived with both during and after the cases. And it's a challenge to make that entertaining for people without it being too dark. But that's kind of what I do now.
Well, I think that's great. And thank you so much for spending time and chatting
Sure.
about this.
Absolutely.
It's
Anytime.
really important work. So thank you.
Thanks.
Up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host Brandon Morgan and I discuss the case in more detail. And as always, thanks for listening. And one more thing, please check out our Criminal Mischief YouTube channel at evocreative.com. From Pie in the Sky Media, Criminal Mischief is an EVO production, recorded live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. For EVO Creative, I'm Carolyn Ossorio, your writer and host.